Imagine a tractor so powerful it could pull half your farm in one pass, or so futuristic it looked more like a jet than a workhorse. These machines were built to change farming forever, but instead they crashed, burned, or were simply forgotten. Today, we're counting down 10 tractors from the 1960s to the 1990s that could have reshaped American agriculture but flopped instead. You won't believe what went wrong with some of these bold, bizarre, and downright legendary failures. Number 1. Ford 6000 Selecto Speed. In 1961, Ford was determined to make a big splash in the American tractor market. The company had already built a reputation for affordable utility tractors, but it wanted something modern, powerful, and high-tech to compete with the rising horsepower race led by John Deere and International Harvester. The result was the Ford 6000, introduced with much fanfare as the company's first six-cylinder row crop tractor and the flagship of its lineup. What made the 6000 special was its Selecto Speed transmission, a fully power-shift gearbox that allowed the operator to shift through 10 forward and 2 reverse speeds without using the clutch. In theory, this was revolutionary. Farmers could change speeds on the go, something that was especially useful when moving between different soil conditions. It was supposed to be a tractor that saved time and effort while delivering 66 PTO horsepower, very competitive for the early 1960s. But reality soon came crashing down. The Selecto Speed was plagued with reliability issues from the start. Clutches slipped, gears failed, and transmissions overheated. Within a year of its release, Ford took the unprecedented step of issuing a recall on every Ford 6000 sold. Dealers brought the tractors back, retrofitted them with redesigned transmissions, and rebranded the updated machines as the 6000 Commander. Even with the fixes, the 6000 never recovered its reputation. Farmers had lost confidence in it, and stories of failures spread quickly in rural communities. Ford eventually discontinued the model in 1967. After selling far fewer units than expected. Yet, despite its flop status, the Ford 6000 deserves recognition. The Selecto Speed concept was ahead of its time. Modern tractors use advanced power shift and continuously variable transmissions as standard equipment, proving Ford's idea was right, even if the execution was wrong. The 6000 stands as a cautionary tale. Innovation has to be matched by durability, especially when farmers depend on their machines for their livelihoods. Number 2. Minneapolis Moline G1355. By the early 1970s, Minneapolis Moline was struggling to stay relevant in the competitive high-horsepower tractor market. Deere had its 4020 and soon the 4430. International Harvester was pumping out the 1066, and Case was finding success with its big 6 cylinders. Moline's answer was the G1355, a tractor that looked good on paper but ended up being another nail in the company's coffin. The G1355 packed serious muscle for its day, around 101 PTO horsepower from a big 6-cylinder diesel supplied by Oliver. It was marketed as the ultimate row crop tractor for expanding farms, combining modern styling with raw pulling power. Minneapolis Moline hoped this model would finally give them a competitive edge in the escalating horsepower race. But instead of a savior, the G1355 became a symbol of overreach. The biggest issue was durability. The transmission and rear end simply weren't built to handle that much power. Farmers who hooked the tractor to heavy implements quickly found themselves facing cracked housings, stripped gears, and endless repair bills. Word spread fast in farm country that the G1355 was a powerhouse that couldn't stay in one piece. Timing also worked against it. By 1972, White Motor Corporation had already absorbed Minneapolis Moline, Oliver, and Cockshut into one shaky conglomerate. Dealers were unsure how long the brand would even survive, and parts support was patchy. Many farmers decided to put their money into Deere or IH instead of gambling on a brand with an uncertain future. Production of the G1355 ended in 1974, barely 2 years after it began. Fewer than 1,000 units were ever built, and it failed to make a dent in the marketplace. Today, surviving G1355s are rare and highly collectible, but they remain remembered as a flop, a tractor that had the power farmers wanted but none of the staying power they needed. Number 3. John Deere 8010-8020. By 1960, the horsepower race in American agriculture was heating up. Farmers were expanding their operations, and the demand for tractors that could pull ever larger implements was growing. John Deere decided to meet that demand head-on with its first four-wheel drive tractor, the 8010, introduced in 1960. The 8010 was a beast, weighing nearly 20,000 pounds and rated at 215 horsepower. It was among the most powerful tractors on the market. It was built to pull wide plows, heavy cultivators, and big seeders across the vast fields of the Great Plains. Its articulated frame allowed it to turn sharply despite its size, and Deere promoted it as the tractor that could replace multiple smaller machines on large farms. But the rollout was rough. Mechanical issues plagued the 8010, especially with its transmission. Deere was forced to recall all 8010s and retrofit them with stronger components, rebranding the improved version as the 8020 in 1961. Even then, the tractor was far ahead of its time. At $30,000, a huge sum in the early 1960s, it was too expensive for most farmers. Only 100 units were built before production ended in 1964. Farmers who did own an 8020 often loved its raw power, but its limited availability, high price, and lack of dealer support kept it from gaining traction in the market. Deere wouldn't return to the four-wheel drive segment until later in the decade, when the technology had matured and the economics made more sense. In hindsight, the 8010-20 was a flop commercially, but a landmark historically. It paved the way for the massive 4WT tractors that became standard on large farms in the 1970s and beyond. Deere proved it could build a machine of that scale, even if the market wasn't ready in 1960. Today, surviving 8020s are prized collector's items, symbols of Deere's bold leap into high horsepower territory. Number 4. Case 1200 Traction King. The early 1960s saw a surge of interest in four-wheel drive tractors. Large farms in the Great Plains and Midwest needed machines that could pull wider plows and handle tough soil conditions. J.I. Case, already known for building strong standard tractors, decided to jump into this new segment with the Case 1200 Traction King, introduced in 1963. The Traction King was an articulated 4WD tractor, one of the very first of its kind to be mass-produced in the U.S. It packed an impressive 120 horsepower, powered by a 6-cylinder diesel engine, and weighed more than 15,000 pounds. Its articulated steering allowed it to pivot in the middle, giving it a surprisingly tight turning radius for such a massive machine. Case advertised it as a tractor that could replace multiple smaller tractors and cut costs for big operators. At first glance, the 1200 seemed like a breakthrough. It was strong, imposing, and offered farmers the promise of high productivity. But reality set in quickly. The tractor had a very high cab position, which gave it a somewhat awkward look and made it feel unstable to operators. Its articulation system was underdeveloped, leading to handling quirks and frequent breakdowns in the steering joints. The rear visibility was poor, and farmers often complained about how difficult it was to hitch up implements compared to traditional row crop tractors. Durability was another issue. The drivetrain and articulation joints were prone to wear under heavy use, and repairs were both expensive and time-consuming. Dealers struggled to support the new machine, as many had little experience with articulated 4WDs. Meanwhile, companies like Steiger and Versatile, which specialized in four-wheel drive tractors, began to outpace Case with designs that were more reliable and farmer-friendly. Case discontinued the 1200 by the end of the decade, having sold only a modest number. While it was a flop in the marketplace, it was historically important. The Traction King introduced many farmers to the idea of articulated 4WD. Case would go on to refine the concept in later models, but the 1200 itself is remembered as a bold but flawed first attempt, an example of being first to market without being fully ready. Number 5. Allis-Chalmers D21. When Allis-Chalmers unveiled the D21 in 1963, it made headlines as the first row crop tractor to top 100 horsepower. At a time when most competitors were still selling tractors in the 60 to 80 horsepower range, the D21 promised to usher in a new era of high horsepower farming. Its sleek design, tall stance, and bold styling made it look every bit as futuristic as it sounded. Farmers who wanted to stay ahead of the horsepower race couldn't help but take notice. The D21 came with a 7.0-liter six-cylinder diesel engine that delivered around 103 PTO horsepower, a groundbreaking figure for row crop tractors in the mid-1960s. It also featured a roomy operator platform and modern styling that set it apart from the competition. Alice Chalmers promoted it aggressively, positioning it as the ultimate machine for progressive farmers with expanding acreages. Unfortunately, the D21's reach exceeded its grasp. The tractor developed a reputation for rear-end failures, especially in early models. Its final drives simply weren't built to handle the stress of pulling heavy implements at that horsepower level. Farmers who pushed the D21 to its advertised limits often ended up with broken components and expensive repairs. Word of these problems spread quickly, tarnishing the model's reputation. Another problem was timing. When Deere released the 4020 in 1964, it quickly became the industry standard with its proven reliability, versatility, and comfort. The D21, despite its horsepower advantage, couldn't match the 4020's all-around appeal. Many farmers also found the D21 too tall and bulky for row crop work, making it less practical than advertised. By 1969, Alice Chalmers discontinued the D21 after selling fewer units than expected. Still, the tractor left a mark. It pushed the industry toward the idea that 100-plus horsepower row crop tractors were not only possible but necessary. The horsepower race that dominated the 1970s and arguably began with the D21. In that sense, it wasn't a total failure, but in its own time, it was seen as a flop that arrived too soon, too big, and not tough enough to deliver on its promises. Number 6. Oliver, 2255. By the early 1970s, Oliver was under pressure to compete in the growing high-horsepower tractor market. Deere, IH, and Case were all producing powerful machines to meet the demands of bigger farms and larger implements. Oliver's answer was the 2255. A tractor that packed a serious punch with its engine choice, the GM Detroit Diesel 8V71 two-stroke V8. Rated at over 145 PTO horsepower, the Oliver 2255 was one of the most powerful tractors in the company's history. The Detroit diesel engine gave it a distinctive roar that could be heard across the fields, and for some farmers that sound was thrilling. The tractor came in both two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive configurations, with a rugged frame and plenty of muscle. On paper, it looked like Oliver had built a competitive powerhouse that could rival anything Deere or IH offered. But the choice of engine proved to be the 2255's undoing. The Detroit Diesel 8V71 was notorious for being loud, thirsty, and temperamental. Its two-stroke design guzzled fuel at a rate that shocked farmers accustomed to the efficiency of six-cylinder diesels from Deere or IH. The engine also required operators to run it at high RPMs to get full power, which didn't suit typical farm work where lugging ability was valued. Farmers often found themselves either frustrated by the engine's quirks or worn down by its ear-splitting noise. Reliability issues compounded the problem. The engine's high revving nature caused stress on driveline components, leading to frequent failures. Maintenance was complicated, and parts availability wasn't always consistent. While a small group of farmers loved the raw power of the 2255, the majority saw it as impractical compared to quieter, more fuel-efficient competitors. By the mid-1970s, Oliver's financial troubles and corporate shakeups at parent company White Motor Corporation further limited support for the 2255. Production ended in 1976 after a relatively short run, and the model quickly gained a reputation as one of Oliver's more ill-fated experiments. In retrospect, the 2055 showed that raw horsepower alone wasn't enough to win over farmers. Efficiency, reliability, and operator comfort mattered just as much. The tractor could have been a game-changer if Oliver had chosen a more conventional engine, but instead, it became a symbol of missed opportunity in a decade when every misstep pushed smaller brands closer to collapse. Number 7. International Harvester 2+2 Series Snoopy, 1979 to 1985. By the late 1970s, International Harvester was searching for a way to stand out in an increasingly competitive tractor market. Deere, Case, and emerging 4WD specialists like Steiger and Versatile were dominating the high horsepower segment. IH engineers decided to create something entirely different, the 2+2 series, introduced in 1979. The 2+2 looked unlike anything else on the market. Its nickname, Snoopy, came from its unusual design. The operator sat far forward, with the engine located in a long nose that jutted out in front. The tractor was articulated, but unlike traditional 4WDs, only the front half pivoted. This design was meant to combine the row crop versatility of a two-wheel drive tractor with the traction of a four-wheel drive machine. The idea was bold. Farmers could get more pulling power without giving up the maneuverability they needed for row crop work. On paper, the 2+2 had promise. Models like the 3388, 3588, and 3788 offered between 130 and 170 horsepower. The forward cab gave operators excellent visibility over the field, and the unique articulation system allowed for relatively tight turns. IH marketed the 2+2 as the tractor that does it all, hoping to capture both row crop and large acreage farmers. But the reality was less flattering. The articulation system caused handling quirks, and the tractors often felt unstable at higher speeds. The long nose made them cumbersome for certain row crop tasks, despite the visibility advantage. Many farmers found the ride rough and the weight distribution awkward, especially when using heavy rear-mounted implements. Reliability issues also plagued the series. Components borrowed from smaller tractors were often overstressed in the larger 2+2 models, leading to drivetrain problems. Dealers struggled to service the unusual design, and parts availability could be frustrating. To make matters worse, the farm crisis of the 1980s hit just as IH was trying to sell these unconventional machines. Farmers had little appetite for risky investments, and the 2+2's odd appearance and mixed performance made it an easy target for skepticism. By 1985, as IH itself collapsed and merged with Case, the 2+2 was discontinued. While a handful of farmers swore by them, the majority saw the series as an interesting but impractical detour in tractor evolution. Today, they're remembered as some of the strangest tractors ever built, proof that sometimes thinking too far outside the box can backfire. Number 8. Massey Ferguson 1500-1800 series. In the 1970s, the race for bigger and more powerful 4WD tractors was heating up. Companies like Steiger and Versatile were setting the standard for heavy-duty articulated machines, while John Deere and Case were preparing their own entries. Massey Ferguson, already a household name in row crop tractors, decided it couldn't sit on the sidelines. The result was the MF 1500 and 1800 series, two massive 4WD tractors that promised much but delivered little. Rather than designing their own from the ground up, Massey struck a deal with Wagner, a small company in Oregon that had been building big articulated tractors since the 1950s. Wagner supplied the basic machines, and Massey put its name on them, painted them red, and sent them out to its dealer network. On paper, it seemed like a smart shortcut. Massey would instantly have a big 4WD competitor without the years of development work. The MF 1500 delivered about 174 horsepower, while the 1800 pushed closer to 215. These were huge numbers at the time, and the tractors themselves were equally imposing, weighing over 20,000 pounds and designed to pull the biggest plows and cultivators money could buy. Farmers who saw them at shows were impressed by their sheer size and power. But reality told a different story. The tractors were clumsy and poorly matched to the needs of most row crop farmers. Their articulation and steering systems were crude compared to Steiger's designs, making them awkward to maneuver. Reliability was another sore point. The drivetrain struggled under constant heavy loads, and repair parts weren't easy to come by. Worse still, Massey's dealer network wasn't prepared to service such complex machines. At the same time, the price tag was steep. Farmers who could afford a tractor that big often turned to Steiger or Versatile, companies that had already built reputations for durability. Massey's attempt looked like an outsider move, a quick rebrand rather than a serious competitor. Sales were dismal, and by the late 1970s, the experiment was quietly abandoned. Today, the MF 1500 and 1800 are remembered as bold but misguided entries into the 4WD market. They showed that even a big name like Massey couldn't just slap its badge on someone else's design and expect farmers to trust it. Number 9. White American Series. By the late 1980s, White Farm Equipment was in serious trouble. The company, once a respected name in tractors and combines, had been battered by the farm crisis, management missteps, and strong competition from Deere, Case IH, and Ford. In a last-ditch effort to regain market share, White introduced the American Series tractors in 1988. The idea behind the American Series was straightforward: build a line of budget-friendly tractors that could appeal to smaller and mid-sized farmers who couldn't afford the increasingly expensive machines from the big players. The series included models like the American 60, American 80, and American 100, named after their horsepower ratings. They were simple, no-frills machines, designed for affordability and ease of use. On paper, this seemed like a smart strategy. Many farmers in the late 80s were still recovering from financial hardship, and a lower-cost tractor might have seemed attractive. White marketed the American Series as dependable, made-in-USA machines that could handle day-to-day farm chores without unnecessary bells and whistles. But the tractors flopped almost immediately. First, they were underpowered compared to competitors' offerings. Farmers who needed serious pulling power looked elsewhere, while those who wanted utility tractors found better options in imports from companies like Kubota and emerging compact brands. Second, the build quality wasn't impressive. The American Series felt cheap compared to the durable, full-featured models from Deere and Case IH. Farmers who had already been burned by White's financial instability weren't eager to take another risk. Timing was also poor. By the late 1980s, the farm economy was beginning to recover, and many farmers preferred to invest in long-lasting, higher-quality equipment rather than bargain models. The American Series was caught in a no-man's land, too plain for large farms and too clumsy to compete with nimble utility tractors. By 1991, the American Series was discontinued, marking one of White's last serious attempts at reviving its tractor line before the brand disappeared altogether. Today, the American Series is mostly forgotten, remembered only as a desperate swing by a struggling company. It could have filled a niche for affordable US-built tractors, but poor execution and bad timing doomed it from the start. Number 10. John Deere 8630. By the mid-1970s, John Deere was determined to make its mark in the booming 4WD articulated tractor market. Farmers in the Great Plains were demanding more horsepower than ever, and companies like Steiger and Versatile were filling that demand with rugged, reliable machines. Deere's answer was the 8630, introduced in 1975 as its first large-scale articulated 4WD tractor. On paper, the 8630 looked like a winner. It was rated at around 275 horsepower, powered by Deere's big six-cylinder 531 cubic inch turbocharged diesel. Its size and weight made it ideal for pulling 40-foot plows and big cultivators, and Deere promoted it as the tractor that could finally compete head-to-head with the independent 4WD specialists. With Deere's massive dealer network and reputation for reliability, farmers expected big things. But the 8630 quickly gained a reputation for failure. The biggest problem was the engine. Deere's 531 turbo diesel wasn't up to the demands of heavy, constant tillage. Overheating, blown head gaskets, and cracked blocks became all too common. Farmers who invested huge sums in these machines found themselves staring at massive repair bills after only a few seasons. The transmission and driveline didn't fare much better, with many components wearing out under the strain of all that horsepower. Stories spread across farm country of 8630s sidelined in the shop, while cheaper Steigers and Versatiles kept right on running. Deere scrambled to patch the issues, eventually introducing the 8640 and 8650 with improved cooling and stronger components. But the damage was done. The 8630 became infamous as one of Deere's biggest missteps, proof that even the green giant could stumble when it entered unfamiliar territory. Yet, in hindsight, the 8630 was also an important step. Deere learned hard lessons about building reliable, high-horsepower 4WDs, lessons that would pay off in later generations. Today, collectors view the 8630 as a flawed pioneer, a tractor that looked unstoppable but instead became a cautionary tale. So there you have it, 10 tractors that promised the future but delivered disappointment. Some were too ambitious, some too expensive, and some just ahead of their time. But each one left behind lessons that shaped the machines we use today. Which of these tractors do you think had the most potential, and which one was the biggest flop? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into the wild history of farming machines. Until next time, keep those engines running and the stories alive.